Ben Carter, a man in his 40s, was what people in the trucking world called a road veteran. His cab wasn't just a truck. It was his home on wheels. On the dashboard, a few yellowed photographs clung stubbornly to their place. Snapshots of his youth, memories of times long gone. Behind the driver's seat, his sleeping area was cluttered with water bottles, old maps, and a trusty coffee maker that had outlasted more than a dozen trips. Ben loved the road for its quiet. He avoided people whenever he could, preferring music and his own thoughts as his only company. His life was simple. Take a job, deliver the cargo, get paid. But over the years, the monotony weighed heavier, and he found himself thinking more often that the roads felt the same, while his cab had turned into a cage he couldn't escape. That night, he had accepted another routine job. A straightforward run across a deserted highway heading west. The cargo, some crates with unspecified contents, but he didn't care what they held. For Ben, the instruction "do not open" was enough. He loaded the crates, checked his truck, and rolled out into the darkness. The road stretched endlessly before him, a black ribbon disappearing into the fog. Ben kept a close eye on every curve, trying to ignore the strange feeling growing in his gut. Then he noticed something unusual. A thin mist creeping onto the highway. It was odd. There wasn't supposed to be any fog in this area, especially not in dry weather. Ben switched on his high beams, but the mist only grew denser, as if trying to obscure the road ahead. He gripped the wheel tighter. "What the hell?" he muttered under his breath. A few minutes later, the radio, his ever-reliable companion, began to crackle. At first, it was just faint static, but then through the interference came fragmented words. Disappearance. Searching. Deserted highway. Ben furrowed his brow and leaned back in his seat. Great. Of course, the signal cuts out when you need it, he thought, though the unease in his chest continued to grow. The news mentioned someone missing in this very area. The last time they'd been seen, they were traveling the same highway Ben was on. The darkness outside grew thicker. The mist reflected his headlights, creating ghostly shapes at the edge of his vision. Ben smirked to himself. Nonsense. Just fatigue playing tricks on me. He didn't know this night would become anything but ordinary, and not in a good way. The road stretched on, endless and dark, with only the occasional flicker of Ben Carter's headlights cutting through the mist. He gripped the wheel, his eyes scanning the highway ahead, but something caught his attention. A figure stood at the side of the road, barely visible in the faint glow of his headlights. It wasn't moving. The person stood still, leaning slightly forward, as if waiting for something. They didn't raise their hand to signal or wave him down, just stood there, staring into the distance. Ben instinctively eased off the gas, his truck slowing to a crawl. His fingers tapped on the steering wheel as he debated what to do. You can't just drive past, he muttered to himself, though he wasn't entirely convinced. Something deep inside made him press the brakes and stop. The truck idled as Ben lowered the window. Hey, you okay? He called out into the night, his voice carried by the hum of the engine. The figure slowly turned their head to face him. They didn't respond but instead began walking toward the cab, their movements deliberate, almost as if they had been expecting the ride. Ben hesitated, then shrugged. Fine. Just don't soak the seat, he joked weakly, trying to shake off his unease. The man climbed into the cab with an air of strange calm. He was taller than average, but his thin, almost gaunt frame made him seem out of proportion. His clothes, a black, tattered overcoat and worn boots, looked like they belonged to another time, smeared with mud at the edges. What struck Ben most was how wet the man appeared. His coat and hair glistened as though he'd been caught in a downpour, yet no water dripped onto the seat or the floor. The dampness seemed contained to his body, defying logic. The man's pale face was devoid of emotion, his sunken eyes fixed ahead. Not far, just heading that way, the man said, his voice quiet, almost monotone. Ben gave a curt nod, though a chill crept up his spine. Something about the man's voice sounded off, like an echo from a distant place. All right, just tell me where to stop, Ben replied, starting the engine again and refocusing on the road. The passenger fell silent, staring out the windshield. Ben tried to make conversation to ease the growing tension. "So, what were you doing out there at this time of night?" he asked. The man didn't answer. He didn't even flinch. Ben tried again. "Rough night for a walk, huh? Storm catch you off guard?" Still no response. The man didn't even glance at him. His gaze locked on something far beyond the road. "All right, I get it. Not much of a talker," Ben muttered, his unease growing. But there was something else. The man's clothes didn't just look old. They looked ancient, like they'd been left in an attic for decades. "What the hell?" Ben thought, but kept his suspicions to himself. The cab felt colder now, though the air conditioning was off. Ben stole a glance at the passenger, who remained completely still, his hands resting unnaturally on his lap. His presence felt heavy, oppressive, as though the air around him was thicker. For the first time in years, Ben wished he hadn't stopped. The rhythmic hum of the truck's engine filled the cab, but the silence between the two men was unnerving. Ben kept his eyes on the road, trying to ignore the oppressive atmosphere. His passenger hadn't moved since they started driving, sitting unnaturally still and staring blankly into the darkness ahead. Ben occasionally glanced at him, hoping to see some sign of normalcy. A shift in posture, a deep breath, anything. But the man remained rigid. His eyes were distant, as if he wasn't looking at the road but at something far beyond it. Then, suddenly, the man opened his mouth as though to say something, but no words came out. He closed it again, and for a moment, Ben thought he'd imagined it. "You all right there?" Ben asked, trying to sound casual. "Yes," the man replied, his voice a monotone whisper. The single word did little to reassure Ben. Minutes passed in silence, and just as Ben started to relax, he heard something, a faint whisper. He snapped his head toward the passenger. The man sat motionless, his lips barely moving, murmuring something too quiet to make out. "What did you say?" Ben asked sharply, his voice betraying his unease. "Nothing," the man replied, his gaze still fixed on the road ahead. But Ben was certain he'd heard something. The whisper wasn't just random noise, it had a rhythm to it, almost like a chant. It sent a shiver down his spine. A few minutes later, the whispering started again, a little louder this time. "What the hell are you mumbling about?" Ben snapped, his grip tightening on the wheel. The man didn't answer. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and gave the faintest hint of a smile before returning to his eerie silence. The road, which had always been a familiar comfort to Ben, now seemed alien. The truck's navigation system, typically a reliable guide, began acting strangely. The distance to his destination fluctuated wildly. One moment it displayed just a few miles. The next it added dozens more. Ben frowned, tapping the screen in frustration. "Piece of junk," he muttered, though the erratic behavior of the device unnerved him. The road itself seemed to stretch endlessly, as if refusing to let him escape. Familiar landmarks were nowhere to be seen, and the highway felt unnaturally long, its edges swallowed by the thickening fog. Then there were the road signs. Ben had driven this route countless times and knew it like the back of his hand, but the signs now looked wrong. Their surfaces were rusted and faded, the letters barely legible, as if they had been abandoned for decades. "What the hell is going on here?" Ben whispered to himself, leaning forward to get a better look at one of the signs. Its words seemed to blur and shift, defying him to read them. Just then, a dull thudding sound echoed through the cab. It was faint but persistent, like something tapping on the truck from the inside. Ben glanced in the rearview mirror, but the dimly lit space behind him revealed nothing unusual. Probably something shifting in the back, he told himself, though the excuse felt hollow. The thudding was followed by a soft scraping noise, as if something or someone was moving around the cab. Ben's stomach tightened, and he stole a glance at his passenger. The man didn't react, didn't even blink, as if the sounds didn't exist. "All right, this is getting ridiculous," Ben muttered under his breath. He was a man who prided himself on keeping his cool, but the unease gnawed at him, threatening to crack his composure. Outside, the darkness seemed thicker than it had any right to be. His headlights, usually strong enough to pierce even the densest fog, barely illuminated the road ahead. The world beyond the windshield felt distant, like a place he no longer belonged to. Ben Carter was no stranger to long, lonely nights on the road, but this was different. Every noise, every flicker of the lights on his dashboard felt like an omen. His passenger's silence was no longer merely unsettling. It was suffocating. The road, once a symbol of freedom, now felt like a trap, stretching endlessly into a darkness that seemed alive. Ben gritted his teeth and kept driving, clinging to the hope that this nightmare would end when he reached his destination. The steady hum of the truck's engine was suddenly broken by a faint thumping sound. Ben stiffened, his hands tightening on the wheel. The sound came again, a quiet but distinct knock, as though someone was tapping on the cab from inside. At first, he thought it was a mechanical issue. Old trucks like his were known for their quirks, but this sound was different. It wasn't random. It was rhythmic. Ben glanced sideways at his passenger, but the man remained as still as a statue, his gaze fixed straight ahead. He showed no signs of having heard the noise. Then came a soft rustling noise from the back of the cab, near the small sleeping area. Ben's breath caught in his throat. He quickly darted his eyes to the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone. But the dimly lit space was empty. Something must have shifted, he muttered to himself, though the explanation felt flimsy even as he said it. Moments later, he felt a subtle shift beneath his seat, as if something had slid under it. He leaned forward, glancing down, but saw nothing out of place. His gaze returned to the dashboard, and his stomach dropped. The thermos he always kept securely on the console was now lying on the passenger seat. His favorite lighter, which had been tucked into the door pocket, was now near the pedals. "That's not possible," Ben whispered, his voice barely audible over the engine. He turned to the passenger, his voice sharp. "Hey, this isn't funny. If you're messing with me, stop it." The man didn't react. He remained motionless, his face expressionless, as if the sounds and movements didn't concern him at all. The eerie silence in the cab was broken by the passenger's voice. It was quiet, almost a whisper, but it cut through the tension like a knife. "You've been on the road a long time, Ben," the man said, his eyes never leaving the windshield. Ben's chest tightened. He hadn't told the man his name. "How do you know my name?" he demanded, his voice shaking slightly. The man didn't answer. Instead, a faint, unsettling smile spread across his lips. "I didn't tell you my name," Ben repeated, louder this time. "It doesn't matter," the man said calmly. "You've spent years out here, always alone, always searching for something you can't find." Ben's pulse quickened. The words hit too close to home. It wasn't just a lucky guess. This man seemed to know him, know his life. But how? "You look at the photographs on your dashboard," the man continued, his voice steady and unervingly calm, "and you think about what you've lost, the time you'll never get back." Ben's grip on the wheel tightened. The photos on his dashboard were personal snapshots of a life he'd left behind for the open road. The thought that this stranger knew about them made his skin crawl. "All right, enough of this," Ben snapped. "I don't know who you are or what you're trying to pull, but I don't like it." For the first time, the passenger turned to look at him. His eyes were dark, impossibly deep, like bottomless pits that seemed to draw Ben in. "You already know this wasn't a coincidence," the man said softly. A cold sweat broke out on Ben's forehead. He quickly turned his attention back to the road, trying to block out the man's words, and the way his gaze felt like it was peeling back layers of his soul. The road ahead seemed endless, stretching into a darkness that felt more like a void than the familiar night sky. Ben could no longer dismiss the thought that something was profoundly wrong. The noises in the cab, the shifting objects, and the passenger's unsettling knowledge of his life. All of it was too much to ignore. Whatever this man was, he wasn't just another hitchhiker. And Ben wasn't sure he wanted to know the truth. Ben Carter felt the atmosphere growing heavier with each passing minute. The night road had always been a familiar comfort to him, but this time, everything felt different. The truck's windshield began to fog up, as though an invisible mist was settling on it. He reached out to wipe the glass, but his palm encountered an unnatural cold. The temperature in the cab had dropped sharply, even though the air conditioner was off. "What the hell?" Ben muttered, running his fingers over the dashboard in search of an explanation. In the rearview mirror, he caught a glimpse of something strange. A dark, semi-transparent shadow, too large to be a normal reflection. It moved behind the truck, seemingly defying its speed, as though trying to catch up. Ben quickly glanced back, but all he saw was the empty trailer stretching into the darkness. "Must be fatigue," he tried to convince himself, though his heart pounded in his chest like a trapped bird. Suddenly, the passenger turned his head toward Ben. The movement was slow, almost mechanical. When he spoke, his voice was quiet yet piercing. "We're getting close to the place where I left my soul." The words hung in the air like an icy breath. Ben felt the chill seep into his bones. He gripped the wheel so tightly that his fingers turned white. "What do you mean?" he asked, trying to keep his voice steady, but no answer came. The passenger stared back at the road, as if he hadn't spoken at all. After those words, an unnatural silence filled the cab. Only the steady hum of the engine reminded Ben that the truck was still moving. He felt the air grow thick, like an impenetrable fog, making each breath a laborious effort. The radio, which he'd left on for company, began to emit strange interference. At first, it was just static, but soon it was punctuated by odd sounds, distant cries or moans that seemed to come from another world. Ben tried to ignore the noises. He focused on the road, repeating to himself that it was just his fatigue and imagination playing tricks on him. But the droning in the cab grew louder, and the sense of danger became harder to dismiss. Meanwhile, the passenger sat motionless, like a statue. He didn't shift in his seat, move his hands or legs, or even blink. His face remained detached, as though he were far away, not physically, but spiritually. Time seemed to slow to a crawl. Each second felt longer than it should have. The anticipation that something was about to happen hung thick in the air. Out of the corner of his eye, Ben noticed strange impressions forming on the windshield. Shadowy handprints that seemed to fade the moment he looked directly at them. Several long minutes passed before Ben finally worked up the nerve to glance at his passenger again. He turned his head, intending to say something, though he wasn't sure what, but the seat was empty. The passenger was gone. Ben froze, holding his breath as he glanced around. The cab looked as though no one had ever been there. No signs, no traces, no evidence that someone had been sitting next to him the entire journey. "This is impossible," he muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. His thoughts raced. Maybe the man had gotten out at some point, but Ben was sure he hadn't stopped. Maybe it was all in his head? In the silence that followed, a faint sound reached his ears. It was a creak, coming from somewhere near the trailer. At first, he dismissed it as road noise, but the sound was too deliberate, too clear. The creaking came again, and Ben realized it was coming from the back, near the cargo. His chest tightened with fear. He looked into the rearview mirror but saw nothing unusual. The darkness behind him seemed thicker, more impenetrable than anywhere else. The creaking stopped, leaving behind a heavy, oppressive silence that was harder to endure than the sound itself. Ben Carter finally saw a faint light ahead. It was the sign that he was nearing his destination, a small warehouse located far from civilization. Only a few dim lamps illuminated the lot, where a handful of trucks stood, looking as solitary and weathered as his own. He parked the truck in the designated spot, turned off the engine, and sat still for a moment. His hands no longer trembled, but the exhaustion in his body was overwhelming. "It was all in my head," he whispered, leaning against the steering wheel. "Just a rough trip." He tried to rationalize everything that had happened. The fog, the strange sounds, the passenger. It could all be explained by fatigue, stress, or even a fleeting hallucination. "Maybe I just nodded off for a second and dreamed it all," he thought, forcing a faint smile. Sitting in the quiet cab, he began to see the humor in the situation. Old Carter's finally lost it. Seeing ghosts now, he muttered, though the words felt more like an attempt to reassure himself. He unbuckled his seatbelt and decided to take a breather before unloading the truck. Climbing out of the cab, he took a few deep breaths of the crisp night air. It helped calm his nerves, though the uneasy feeling lingered. As he walked toward the warehouse to check in, his mind churned with thoughts. There was no passenger. I'm just overtired. That's all it was. He repeated to himself, trying to bury the gnawing fear. For a brief moment, reality seemed to reassert itself. The lot was quiet, the air still. Everything was normal, or so he thought. After a few minutes, Ben returned to his truck. The unloading had been postponed until morning, giving him time to rest. He climbed back into the cab and froze. His eyes immediately locked onto the passenger seat. There, where the strange man had been sitting, lay a crumpled piece of paper. Ben's breath hitched. He cautiously reached over and picked it up. The paper felt old, its edges uneven and yellowed, like it had been torn from an ancient notebook. Unfolding it, he found a short message scrawled in smudged ink. "Thanks for the ride. We'll meet again." His heart pounded as he reread the words. He clenched the paper tightly in his hand, as though trying to crush the growing dread. "This has to be a joke," he muttered, his voice trembling. But who could have left the note? The warehouse workers? No, they wouldn't have known about the passenger. And even if they had, how could they have left the note without him noticing? Ben felt his pulse quicken. The cab, which had always been his safe haven, now felt stifling and unfamiliar. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He glanced at the seat again. It looked completely ordinary, yet something about it felt off. He ran his hand over the upholstery. It was slightly colder than it should have been. Leaning back in his seat, Ben stared at the crumpled note in his hand. "We'll meet again." The words echoed in his mind, refusing to let go. He realized now that what had happened on the road wasn't just a figment of his imagination. Someone or something had chosen him, but why? A soft creak interrupted his thoughts. Came from the trailer, faint but unmistakable. It was the same sound he'd heard on the road. Ben's head snapped around, but the lot was empty. He couldn't see anything unusual, yet the sound repeated, louder this time, before fading into the silence. He stared out into the darkness, his pulse racing. For the first time in years, Ben Carter felt truly afraid. Ben crumpled the note into a ball and tossed it into the trash bag in his cab. But even after discarding it, the sense of unease remained. He closed his eyes, trying to will himself to sleep, but the words "we'll meet again" haunted him. The night seemed darker than usual, the shadows deeper, and somewhere, in the stillness, it felt as if something or someone was watching. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. This is just the beginning of the stories we'll uncover here at Horror Haven. Don't forget to subscribe for more chilling tales, and hit the notification bell so you'll never miss the next journey into the unknown. Until next time, stay safe. Or, at the very least, stay in the light.